In this video we're going to focus on the Bible GPS on Lamentations 1 verses 1 to 9. And as usual we're going through the GPS method because we live in the 21st century and the people of Lamentations lived many years before Christ. So there are differences between us in the 21st century and the people of Lamentations of language, tradition, time, situation and history. Many differences. So therefore, to read Lamentations, we need to go through three processes. The first one is understanding. That takes us to the message to the original receiver. Then we go through the process of application. Is that message applicable to us or not? And if it's applicable, we communicate it in the 21st century. So this is our GPS method, and we will use this method on the book of Lamentations, chapter 1. So the first process is understanding, and we know we're going through the process of start. We go and look at the situation of the passage. The T is the type of literature. The A is for analyze the passage to get us to the message to the original receiver. And then we relate that message to the rest of the Bible. And we also read Bible commentaries or study Bibles just to test our findings whether we are on the right track or not. So let's start with the number one. Situation. Lamentations poignantly expresses the people's overwhelming sense of loss that accompanied the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 or 7. We don't know exactly, there's dispute about. Some will say it was 586 BC, other scholars will say 587 BC, but I'm not going to worry about 1 year. So it's an overwhelming sense of loss that accompanied the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Babylonians. They were the world power. Traditionally, Lamentations is attributed to Jeremiah. However, firm authorship cannot be confidently established. But that doesn't matter too much because it will not harm our message. The Hebrew title for the book literally means the Book of the How. The book was written soon after Jerusalem's destruction in 586 BC. The book contains 5 poems, and each poem reflects one chapter, so it has 5 chapters. The first 4 are acrostics, poems that begin each line with the letters of the Hebrew alphabet in succession, and I really like that. I will show you that, how it looks like in the next slide. The poems are for the most part in a rhythm scheme common in funeral hymns. So we have 5 poems and the first 4 are acrostics. Let me show you. You see in the first verse you have the first Hebrew letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, and then the next one is the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet, verse 2, Bet, then Gimel, Dalet, Yeh. So it follows the Hebrew alphabet in succession, and we have 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and so we see 22 verses. Beautifully done, a masterpiece. Chapter 3 is actually a little bit different. It's also acrostic, but it has not 22 verses, but it has 66 verses because each letter of the Hebrew alphabet contains 3 verses. So the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet in chapter 3 is Aleph, Aleph, Aleph. So it contains 3 verses. The next letter is also 3 verses, Bet, Bet. And the next letter is Gimel, also 3 verses. So you have 22 times 3, 66 verses. Chapter 5 is not acrostic, but it also has 22 verses. So it's actually a masterpiece, this book of Lamentation. Wonderful poetry. Type of literature, we've seen its poetry, and it's poetry in the prophets. So we know the situation. It was written after the destruction of Jerusalem. It's a lament, it's poetry. Type of literature. And then we analyze the passage. Now we dig in, and this is where we spend most of our time. We look out for parallelism, similes, metaphors, personification, and hyperbole. And also we remark the main themes. We conclude and summarize the message to the original receiver. So let's start reading chapter 1 verses 1 to 9. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations, she who was queen among the provinces, has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. Before we continue to verse 4, I just want to show you something here. Jerusalem is compared to a widow, and that is why this passage is filled with so many personifications, her and she. You will read it all through this poem. You will get her and you will get she. It's the way that the author wants to describe Jerusalem, the pain, the suffering. And we know that a personification is when you assign the characteristics of a human to lifeless objects. So what do we see also in this first 3 verses? We see a parallelism. How deserted lies the city, how like a widow is she, and then one so full of people, who once was great among the nations. And we know that a parallelism is the connection between two successive lines, and it expressed the same meaning, just in a different way. And we also have a simile, how like a widow is she. And a simile we know is a comparison between people or things using the word like or as. Then we have a metaphor, she who was queen, and now the contrast has now become a slave. And we know that a metaphor is something in terms, you describe something, in this case the city Jerusalem, in terms of something else, like a queen. She used to be like that, now she's like a slave. She is a slave. It's a metaphor. There we have another parallelism in verse 2. By the end of verse 2, all her friends, and then in the second line, they have betrayed her. The second line, have become her enemies. A true parallelism. Verse 4. The roads of Zion mourn, for no one has come to her appointed festivals. All her gateways are desolate. Her priests groan, her young women grieve, and she is in bitter anguish. You hear the personifications here. Her foes have become her masters. Her enemies are at ease. The Lord has brought her grief because of her many sins. Her children have gone into exile, captive before the foe. All the splendor has departed from the daughter Zion. Her princes are like deer that find no pasture in weakness. They have fled before the pursuer. So you see the expression, the true, honest expression of the pain and suffering after the destruction of Jerusalem. So we see another parallelism in verse 4. Her priests groan, her young women grieve. And we also see another one in verse 5. Her foes have become her masters. Her enemies are at ease. And then in verse 6 we see another simile. Her princes are like deer that find no pasture. Verse 7. In the days of her affliction and wandering, Jerusalem remembers all the treasures that were hers in days of old. You hear the personifications again. When her people fell into enemy hands, there was no one to help her. Her enemies looked at her and laughed at her destruction. Jerusalem has sinned greatly and so has become unclean. So we see the reason why God allowed the destruction of Jerusalem. They have sinned greatly. We see that in verse 8. They followed other gods and turned their backs on God. Verse 8. All who honored her despise her, for they have all seen her naked. She herself groans and turns away. Her filthiness clung to her skirts. She did not consider her future. Her fall was astounding. There was none to comfort her. Look, Lord, on my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. You can just see so much pain, so much suffering, and an honest way to express that. And these last few verses are also filled with personifications. Her people fell into enemy hands, that is Jerusalem, her affliction and wandering. So we see in all these 11 verses, 9 verses, the pain, the suffering, the honest expression of seeing the beloved city Jerusalem destroyed. They never could fathom that God will ever allow that city to be destroyed. Now we see the main theme is actually that it's an honest expression of pain, and then we conclude and summarize the message to the original receiver, and we see, and I think we can summarize it like: sin carries with it the consequences of sorrow, grief, misery, and pain. And then we also learn from this passage, because there was honesty. Honesty is the best way out of the depths of despair. It is to connect your emotions to your pain and to express that in words. This is where hope actually begins, when you are able to express how you feel. Then we relate the message to the broader and biblical and theological framework. So we see other passages, and there are multiple passages in the Bible that also expresses the honest cry of people. Psalm 142, I cry aloud to the Lord. I lift my voice to the Lord for mercy. I pour out before him my complaint. Before him I tell my trouble. And even Jesus did that on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? So it's very good to be honest with how you really feel. And then you test your findings by reading Bible commentaries or study Bibles. And then we realize that we are on track. It is actually that sin carries with it the consequences of sorrow, grief, misery, and pain. And then honesty is the best way out of the depths of despair. So I think this is very close how the original receivers received that message. Now we need to apply that message. We need to ask the question, is it applicable or not? If it's applicable, we continue to bring it over in the 21st century. But we need to ask whether it's incidental or essential. If it's a cultural, ceremonial, or civil law, then it's not applicable. And we see there's nothing cultural, ceremonial, or civil. Therefore, it's essential. It has to do with the morality, the heart of God, to establish healthy relationships. Therefore, we communicate it in the 21st century. You can communicate it and discuss this passage in a small group, and you can just pause this video and focus on the following 5 questions. You can also go to day 156 of the Bible as your GPS, or page 108 of Hearing God's Tweet.